to Chad Jackson Live. I'm here with none other than Mr. Delano Squires. How are you today, sir?
Doing quite well. Thank you for having me.
So, Delano, the reason why I asked you to come on this evening is because I was um, very intrigued by a article that you recently wrote for The Blaze. For those of you who don't know, Delano is a contributor to The Blaze. He writes uh, a lot of phenomenal pieces for them. And Delano, I have to be honest with you.
Hmm.
I've grown over the years very weary of this kind of binary between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. But if I'm going to have to
Hmm.
suffer through an article that
Hmm.
that uh, that talks about this kind of rivalry, I'd rather read it from you because you're such a prolific writer. What went into
Appreciate that.
your inspiration in writing this piece?
It was a couple things. One is that Louis Farrakhan turned 90 recently, around the time where I wrote the piece, and I've always been interested in sort of that age old question, right? Martin or Malcolm, right? Who is better for the black community? And I don't necessarily know that there's one single answer. But thinking about Farrakhan, he's getting up in age. Obviously, Jesse Jackson is declining in health. And really, those two men are the most well known, sort of, for lack of a better term, proteges of Dr. King and Malcolm X. And while it is not always, you can never know how a person would have developed or evolved, for lack of a better term, particularly when they die at a young age. But I think it's somewhat fair to judge a tree by its fruit. And to the extent that Jackson and Farrakhan are the fruit of King and Malcolm X, I think it's worth asking which one of those leaders, King and X, um, which one of their worldviews uh, would be, or would have been, or has been best for Black America. And obviously, that's a term that covers a large number of people, diverse backgrounds, different regions of the country. But I thought it was a question worth asking now that we can look back on 60 plus years um, of social, political, and economic progress within the
Right.
Black community.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you on that. So, one of the things that, hold on, let me try to, there I am. So, one of the things
Hmm.
that, just to be completely candid with you, the reason why I get
Hmm.
a bit irritated with the way that people kind of insist on King or Malcolm X is because,
Hmm.
looking into the way that heroes are made and history is written and who is responsible for
Hmm.
picking and choosing who the heroes of a given era would be. One of the things that I found is, as Yuri Bezmenov, the former KGB agent who
Hmm.
defected, as he said,
Hmm.
yesterday's radical pothead hippies are today's academics and history makers and
Hmm.
professionals and so on and so forth. And it is this ilk who kind of writes history for the young and upcoming generations. Uh, the thing, so I was one of the producers for Uncle Tom Part Two, and part of my um, role with the film was to do a great deal of research, and it was through that research that I found that there were actually more than just these two who were involved in what we know as civil rights.
Hmm.
Bob Woodson talks a lot about how his participation in the civil rights movement was that he wanted, or his interest was that he wanted desegregation, not this kind of forced integration that Martin Luther King was
Right.
advocating for. And the
Right.
only other person who would have been on the same platform, because obviously Bob Woodson wasn't on the same platform, didn't enjoy the same degree of popularity as a Martin Luther King or as a Malcolm X at the time. The only person who did is a man named Joseph H. Jackson. Um, and he has been all but forgotten uh, uh, when it comes to how we think about the ways in which so-called black leaders were fighting against segregation and trying
Hmm.
to advocate for opportunities for black people and other people of color. And I doing my research, I grew to really like Dr. J.H. Jackson, because one of the things that I noticed in your piece is how you talked about how Malcolm X, um, you insinuated that he was kind of the better leader, in that he called upon black people to take responsibility in terms of what black folks eat, in terms of being married, in
Hmm.
terms of living a upright moral life, whereas King
Hmm.
focused entirely on the system and calling on white people to have a change of heart. And so it was completely void of any kind of personal responsibility, as it were. Um, your
I wouldn't
issue.
necessarily say that. I wouldn't necessarily say that.
Okay, go ahead.
I think King's emphasis was certainly on changes to law and policy and social structures, right? I think he certainly understood the role that media could play in sort of changing the hearts and minds of white people who would be sympathetic to what you know black folk were marching for and protesting for. So I certainly think that those things are accurate. But I've also read sermons from Dr. King, speeches from Dr. King, where he talks about crime in black neighborhoods, and he says, and I quoted him in a different piece when I was talking about him, and he said something to the effect of, "We can't basically demand that white people treat us well when we're stabbing each other in the streets." All right. So one of the things that I think is important in terms of the context of this conversation is that the 1960s was, that was a completely different time, and not just because it was 60 years ago, but the world was different, the country was different. Every black leader had some level of personal agency, individual responsibility sort of baked into the cake, in the same way that I have a book of essays edited by a man named D.W. Culp, Daniel Wallace Culp. This is from, I want to say, 1902 or 1906. The most famous person in that group of essays, 38 different subjects. The most famous person in it is Booker T. Washington. But there are other names of people who I'd never heard of, but certainly, bright lights in their own regard. And one of the things that's apparent from these people, and some of them were born into the slavery, some of them were born right after emancipation, is that they all of their strategies for uplifting the race rested on the assumption of public morality. So this is they would talk about the importance of thrift and temperance. They would say that the home is where women should have their primary focus, because that is where the hearts and the minds of the children are shaped. They talked about mutual aid societies, and so there's certain things that all of their strategies for racial uplift were built on a foundation, oftentimes a Christian worldview and Christian foundation, but even if not explicitly Christian, one that had deep, deep moral roots. And I think sometimes, particularly people in our generation, we are so bereft of that type of worldview that we assume that when people in previous generations talked about policy changes, changes to the law, that they operated like our leaders operate, quote unquote, leaders operate today, which is to say um, that, I'd say the pundits and politicians today assume that the black community's two biggest problems are income inequality and systemic racism, and that's why their primary two solutions are uh, bigger government and better white people. And I don't think that is how King operate. I don't think that was exclusively how he operated, right?
Hmm.
So I would just put a little caveat in there and say yes, he had a different focus than Malcolm X, but he was not the type of person who would say, "Oh, black people don't have any responsibility." If we would change all of these other things about society and structures, then all the other issues around "quote unquote" black on black violence would take care of themselves. I don't
Yeah.
read King to be that type of leader.
Um, that's a very well put analysis of King, um, and I like how you gave context to other leaders or people who profess to be leaders in terms of their own version of uplift. So I appreciate that.
Hmm.
I guess my problem with King is from my own research. Um, King and a lot of the things that he did and a lot of the ways in which he did them uh, were subversive. That is to say,
Mm.
take Walter Lippmann's book Public Opinion, where he talks about the making of a leader and how I'm not sure what happened there. For some reason, I fell off the screen. But yeah, how if a leader wishes to move a policy or campaign, the way to do it
Hmm.
is to get into the good graces of the people through rhetoric and to use familiar
Hmm.
sounding language, appealing to religion, appealing to patriotism. And once you've gotten into the good graces of the people, you can then co-opt it and push a message that's wholly different from the rhetoric previously espoused. And we see examples of this not only with King but other, people who profess to be leaders over the years. And the reason I would put King in that category is because his closest friends um, admitted to his uh, partiality, I guess you could say, to Marxism. And
Hmm.
when you read his papers, you find that he rejected the or doubted the resurrection of Jesus, which is weird for
Hmm.
one who professes to be a Christian pastor.
Right.
When you look
Right.
at the fact that a lot of his speeches weren't written by him, but were written by people who did belong to the Communist Party, or Stanley Levison, for example, had he was a treasurer of a communist front group in New York. You look at Bayard Rustin, who was a part of the Communist Party as a young man, and carried his communist sentiments well into his old age. And these were the individuals who were writing his speeches. Um,
Hmm.
this is consistent with what Karl Marx himself wrote, where he said in the latter pages of the Communist Manifesto that communists join with every campaign, every democratic campaign around the world, whatever that democratic campaign looks like, always keeping the property interest uh, in mind. And so, was it some kind of grand, well calculated conspiracy? Um, I think that's up for debate or for consideration.
Hmm.
Um, were these things just by happenstance? Possibly, but again, whenever you look at the ways in which King uh, argued for what we all can perceive to be neutrality and meritocracy, to move from there to then go and argue for something like the Poor People's Campaign, for example, which demands a universal income for everyone, and all of these kind of socialist-esque policies. To me, it's
Hmm.
consistent with what Walter Lippmann was talking about in terms of doing a kind of bait and switch, get into the good graces of the people, and then push something completely antithetical to that original uh, verbiage. Go ahead.
Mm. I mean, well, let's start here because I think um, my strongest criticisms of Dr. King are always ones that are theological in nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're right. If a person tells me, I don't care who they are, if they say I'm a Christian, but I don't believe in the resurrection, literal resurrection, not resurrection as allegory for, you know, you pick yourself up off the mat, you dust yourself off, and you try again. No, literally, if someone says that they're a Christian, either a lay person or minister, and they don't believe in the resurrection, they don't believe. in the virgin birth, and most, or as importantly, they don't believe in substitutionary atonement, right? That Christ died on the cross, his righteousness is imputed to all who would believe in him, and our sin was imputed to him, and he bore the penalty for our sin, and we get to enjoy um, the benefits of his righteousness. If you reject that, then to me, I I wouldn't consider that person a Christian, right? That because if a person who rejects the atonement and the resurrection is a Christian, then I don't even know what that word means anymore, right? So you may go to church, you may wear a preacher's robe, but I can't see someone who rejects core, foundational, first order biblical doctrine as being regenerate. So that's those criticisms of Dr. King, I think, are completely fair because they would be the same criticisms I would make of anybody else. I don't care what their politics. But, some of the other, criticisms of his politics and his economic philosophy, while I understand, here's the thing, and I've said this to other people in the past, right? Um, American history is so complex. And it's not just that the history is complex. Um, uh-oh, did you lose me?
No, you're good.
Okay. Um,
Sorry about that. Go ahead.
mhm. It's not just that our history is complex, it's even how we understand our history is complex. So, for instance, when conservatives are trying to stave off the left as they come for George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, their sort of defense will be, well, at that time period, everybody owned slaves, and you know, we're the first country that sought to abolish slavery, and these types of things. They when you read, or when progressives raise the slaveholding legacy of our founding fathers to conservatives, the conservative response is generally, these are men of their times and they have to be understood as such. But some of the same conservatives will turn around and indict King, 200 plus years after Washington and Jefferson and so on and so forth, and say, oh, this guy believed in communism, and as such is such a his views are so incompatible with the American founding and our principles that we should reconsider the extent to which we lionize him. So, to me, it's logically inconsistent to say that the slave master should be read in context and given due deference and have his positions analyzed with a sense of nuance. But even let's go all the way there. But the commie is um, once and for all and forever will be outside of the bounds of any type of respect and honor in terms of our political history. Those two things to me don't square. So I read King in his context, and I can certainly more so understand why a Southern Baptist preacher, again, theological issues notwithstanding, who is maybe two generations removed from slavery, who saw grinding, crushing poverty across the South, I could much more understand why that person would be in favor of a universal basic income, or even be open to Marxism, than I can, the co-founders of BLM in 2016. It was a different day and age. The median occupation at that time in the South for a black woman was domestic. So I get. I'm not saying I agree with King's economic philosophy, but I understand why he would have it.
Yeah.
and that alone is not enough of a reason for me to say, oh, everything else that he stood for should be tossed out of the window. Because again, we don't do that with the founding fathers. We say it's nuanced, it's complex, it's complicated, and they're men of their times, and we should celebrate them for the things that they did right, and we shouldn't toss them into the ash heap of history for the things that we got wrong. And my thing is, if that's a principle that we want to apply to people, I think it's a principle that should be applied um, in a 360-degree arc, not
Yeah.
only applied to the people that we like.
Well, touche. But is it exactly fair, though? Is that a
Hmm.
fair comparison, considering the fact that while some of the founding fathers did own slaves, and then you had
Hmm.
people like Thomas Jefferson who philosophized about the injustice of slavery. I mean, he did write this, and in
Hmm.
fact, he was a politician while at the same time being um, um, a man of moral convictions, I guess you could say, and it was these moral
Hmm.
convictions that informed his position on slavery, although he did own slaves. But that aside, is it exactly a fair comparison to make, considering the fact that Marxism, communism in itself, is an ideology which has historically been disseminated and spread by way of deception, deceit, and subversion? And Martin Luther King himself, I mean, if it were true,
Hmm.
just consider this, if you will.
Hmm.
If it were true, if my claims, which I understand are bold, considering the fact that he is lionized, that he is enshrined, that we do have a day that commemorates him that was
Hmm.
passed under the Reagan administration. And so, with that fact alone, he's one of these people who, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, everybody loves and praises Martin Luther King. Get it? Understood.
Hmm. Hmm.
But if what I'm saying is true, which is that Martin Luther King, uh, a lot of the things that he did for which he is lionized, if it's true that those things were done as a subversive tactic in an disingenuous way, is it then fair to compare him to someone like the founding fathers who were trying to wrestle away um, um, their right to autonomy and independence, not by way of deception, but by way of war? By laying it all out on the table, they issued a declaration of independence, said this is what we do not like
Hmm.
about
Hmm.
our leadership, about our government,
Hmm.
and we are going to go to war to fight for our freedom. Martin Luther King and his ilk didn't so much issue a similar kind of declaration of independence. They used, again, language that was familiar, and the whole idea, the whole objective, was to, in a sense, Trojan horse the American psyche to be susceptible and vulnerable and open to socialist-esque policies that followed. This is also articulated by Bettina Aptheker, who in a 1965 interview said that communism, um, basically the American political landscape is the perfect one for communism because
Hmm.
Americans believe that they live in a democracy. And so when you can democratize things, we can democratize social issues, and you can, in a sense, pull out the heartstrings of America, they will then let their guard down and they will democratize socialism into reality. And so I don't
Hmm.
see Martin Luther King fighting against that. I see Martin Luther King as a participant in that, which is a subversive thing. Um, and the question arises, well, what hope or what other options did he have? Well, for me, I think one of the reasons why there's such a block and a mental block for people is because we've all
Hmm.
went to the same schools, we all graduated from the same schools, we all read the same textbooks, we all understand what the past was like,
Hmm.
juxtapose the kind of man that we're told MLK was, and how MLK
Hmm.
was this, good moral leader who came to, in a sense, deconstruct the way things were. And there was no one else. No one else knew how to do it. But Martin Luther King, here's a guy who got it. And he was a Christian pastor, and he was all these things. Much of what we have learned about him turned out to be either false or inaccurate, or, you know, a myth or what have you. But again, looking at the research, looking at the landscape, and realizing that there were other people like Joseph H. Jackson who believed in the fundamental Christian gospel, not the social gospel, not liberation theology, the fundamental Christian gospel, the inerrancy of the scriptures, the resurrection of Christ. Like, he believed in those things fundamentally. And when you look at his engagement in civil rights, it wasn't this it wasn't the same brand of civil rights that MLK was pushing, in that, you know, we vest certain unconstitutional powers in the federal government, which widens that power and, in a sense, usurps our rights as Americans. Because, you know, to Bob Woodson's point, we shouldn't have given the federal government, the right to force businesses to integrate. Rather, we should have merely taken away the state's right to segregate, which is in itself unconstitutional. So both solutions are unconstitutional, or both the problem and the, you know, MLK solution are unconstitutional, says Bob Woodson, says Barry Goldwater, and many others, even Malcolm X, ironically, made the point that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was unconstitutional on the basis that it gives the federal government, the right to, in a sense, mandate how and who companies hire and serve, such and so forth. And so that aside, like, for me, when I look at someone like a Joseph H. Jackson, he argued that to the extent that the white man doesn't give you a job, it's incumbent upon you to build your own businesses and to hire, you know, your brother and your sister and your neighbor, that you aren't begging someone else for a job. And so he didn't only talk about this, but he exemplified this. There were a bunch of sharecroppers, for example, in the South, who were getting cheated by the farmers down there. And so what he did, because he was the president of the National Baptist Convention, is the convention bought 400 acres of farmland in the South, and they allowed these black sharecroppers to work the land for free. And to the extent that they raised money for their crops, they got to keep and pocket that money so long as they were saving that money to buy their own farmland, so they can move from sharecroppers to farmers and not have to depend on anybody else for their daily bread. And the convention, under the behest of Jackson, did many of these things. Now, the reason why I bring up Jackson and compare in comparison to Martin Luther King is because, as you know, Ebenezer Baptist Church, which is the church that Martin Luther King's father preached at, was under the umbrella of the National Baptist Convention, which was the largest black religious institution in the world, in the world at the time. Martin Luther King, fresh out of Crozer, very young, very ambitious. He wanted to be the president of the National Baptist Convention, and he, threw his hat in the ring to run for president, and he was overwhelmingly rejected. The Negroes in the South preferred Joseph H. Jackson to Martin Luther King, and it got pretty contentious. It got to the point where I think someone was pushed off a stage and died. Someone from Martin Luther King's little, ilk pushed this young man off the stage and he died. So it got pretty contentious, and they ended up kicking Martin Luther King and his friends out of the National Baptist Convention. This was before, his face was plastered on Time magazine and all the rest of it. So what they decided to do at the suggestion of Stanley Levison was start a new Baptist convention, which would rival the National Baptist Convention. So they started the Progressive National Baptist Convention. Of course, it didn't take off. It didn't do anything. So they started this Southern Leadership Conference, and then they moved from there to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and its concoction was the result of, the fact that Martin Luther King and his campaign was not popular to these Negroes in the South as much as Joseph H. Jackson, who was a continuation of the kinds of things that Booker T. Washington talked about.
Right.
Martin Luther King wanted to move the National Baptist Convention into a new, more radical, if I can use that word, social gospel, and to get away from the kind of fundamental gospel that Joseph H. Jackson and his ilk was preaching. He failed to do so, started the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The advantage that Martin Luther King and his ilk had that Joseph H. Jackson did not have is that once the success of the Montgomery bus boycott took off and all the things, the media basically swarmed around Martin Luther King. They made him larger than life. Stanley Levison, who was a phenomenal publicist, he's the one who lined up the interviews, who told the cameras where to be, when to be there, all the things, was able to mobilize the media to put cameras in front of the civil rights movement under the behest of Martin Luther King, and the rest is history. And so, again, Joseph H. Jackson was all but erased from these kinds of conversations that we talk about. It always comes down to Malcolm X and Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
And anyway, I've been monologuing forever, so I want to give it back to you.
Yeah, I mean, as is always the case, whenever I see something that you produce, I'm learning a lot. I wasn't particularly familiar with Joseph H. Jackson, so that'll give me some homework to do. A couple things come to mind. One, I think it is always easy to have clarity when we're looking back on a situation. Making decisions in real time, obviously, it's different, right? Because you don't necessarily know where things are going to end up. That's why I think having a set of principles that you adhere to can serve as a good guardrail for a person, regardless of what the particular issue is. So yeah, would a different set of leaders during that era have produced different results? Quite possibly. Yeah, it's quite possible. And I do share your sentiment in terms of the difference between integration and desegregation. But I also know I have the luxury of having that opinion, having never grown up in a segregated quote unquote school, or walking into a restaurant and it says, colors only on one door and whites only on another, right? So there are, yes, there is a legal and philosophical argument you can make about forced integration violating the principle of free association, and so on and so on and so forth. I think you can make those arguments. But every social or cultural phenomenon is not necessarily going to be measured the same way.
Yeah.
And indignity is a thing, right? It's not just talk. When you go somewhere, you're constantly being reminded that you're a second class citizen. I do think that has an impact on a person. Now, to be fair, and I know you're a historian, so you know these things. There are multiple examples across history, even recent history, of despised minority groups flourishing economically in certain countries. I think about like the East Indians who were in Uganda prior to being kicked out by Idi Amin, right? But one of the ways you do that one of the only ways to do that is to dominate a particular segment of the economy.
Yeah.
So it's possible, but again, when you are a small minority in a country that is openly hostile to you, even if you dominate part of the economy, sometimes that can make the majority even more hostile. So there's a sense in which the law is there to protect you, and And one of the beauties, and this is both a gift and a curse of our system of government, is that it is constructed in many respects to protect minority rights, right? Because I don't think that, and not to be controversial, but I love our system of government. I love you know living in a constitutional republic where we vote for our leaders. But democracy, pure democracy, is might be one of, or certainly can be one of the most tyrannical forms of government.
Oh yeah, one hundred
Because in
percent.
its purest sense, you could get 51% of the population to say, we want to pass a law that says we kill the other 49% of the population and steal all their stuff. And in theory, you could do that if you just get a single person to switch to one side, and now you have the majority.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a system of government that protects the rights, actual rights, not created rights, right? Not, oh, I have a right to a jaguar, but
Mm-hmm.
protects the
Right.
rights of individuals. Um, I think that's a good system to have. So yeah, I mean, the long and short of it for me is that I think King is a flawed leader, certainly theologically, most more than likely personally, and even some of his other political economic decisions are ones that I may not agree with. But I don't expect perfection from any person, and I don't think I think the comparison to the founding fathers is fair in that
Mm-hmm.
in life a man's creeds often at various points in his life will not match his deeds.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, did the founding fathers struggle with slavery? Sure, to some extent, but that is that is as little comfort for, let's say, at the time, enslaved Africans knew that Jefferson struggled with this type of thing, right? Let's say he's on a plantation at Monticello and he would express it like, I'm doing this for your good, to help civilize you, to help you know make you ready to be free in our society. But I really don't want to when slavery really is a blot on humanity and it goes against the principles of inherent human worth and human dignity. That would be as little comfort to them as if, you know, I was writing to my wife about my struggles with infidelity while
Mm-hmm.
I'm in the bed with another woman. And I said, well, I'm struggling. It's hard on me, right? I know I made a vow before family and God that says that I will honor you and love you until death do us part, and so on and so on and so forth. But it's hard to be a one woman man, and I'm struggling with it. And eventually, I want to get out of this adulterous affair, but it's not time yet because I have finances tied up with this woman, and we actually have a child together, and it's going to take me time to work my way out of this situation. But in due time, if you stay the course, if you remain faithful to me, I promise that I will eventually come back to you. No woman's gonna put up with that,
Yeah.
right? So it's like, yeah, I get it, and that's why I'm not a person that says, oh, we need a new founding, we need new national symbols, because I understand that people are flawed, and I'm not arrogant enough to think that because those men had their moral inconsistencies that we in our generation don't have our own. Because I would argue that even with 150 plus years of hindsight, I would argue that the wholesale embrace, particularly on the left, and among many black folk, of abortion on demand is um, violates the notion of human dignity, and particularly the imago Dei, that image of God that every person is stamped with, as slavery did in the 1700s, 1800s, so on and so on and so forth. So even with being able to look back and see how quickly, people can depart from their principles and their ideals, we're still doing the same thing today. And that's how
Yeah.
you have organizations like Planned Parenthood, particularly in 2020, saying we support Black Lives Matter, right? With no sense of self awareness, no sense of irony. It's like, we support Black Lives Matter because we're tired of seeing racist institutions brutalizing the black body. These people, right? They
Right.
no self awareness. So yeah,
Just
so
clueless.
I think right. I think I do not agree with lionizing or deifying any person. Now, if King's children want to deify him and say, "Look, he's daddy to us and he can do no wrong," I get that. We both have kids, and there's an extent to which, particularly if you're a good father, your kids will do that for you. But I think we should deal with everyone's legacy openly, honestly, and consistently. And that is where I tend to come down on these things. So
Mm.
yeah. So net, we benefit from the the nation, the national correction that he helped sort of institute in terms of passing some of those civil rights laws, voting rights laws, so on and so on and so forth. But my point, and this is the point I was making in my piece, is that the heirs to King's throne, so to speak, particularly the people, the black preachers and the politicians, and I'd include the pundits, the professors and the performers, the people I call the aristocracy, the people, but particularly the preachers who think that they are operating his legacy, and you made this point earlier, the ones who see systemic racism and income inequality as, you know, bigger sins than sin itself. I think those men and women have, in many respects, squandered the legacy. They have acquired a tremendous amount of political power and political capital. Obviously, there are far more elected black officials on every level of government today than there were 60 years ago. And black folks are in corporate America and in the C-suite and became president and all so on and so on and so forth. But I would argue that these people sort of secured the bag, so to speak, but fumbled the ball. I don't lay all of that on King. I think he is a singular figure in terms of his rhetoric, his oratory, the role he played in the civil rights movement. And I think the people who tried to copy him um, have made, in many respects, things worse in the black community. And I'll give a quick sort of parallel, particularly so if there's any sports fans that watch the show. Um, Steph Curry, right, guard for the Golden State Warriors, is, I think, hands down the greatest shooter the NBA has ever seen. Not just in terms, I don't know if he has the most three pointers ever. I'm not sure if his 3 point percentage is the highest ever, but he is not your spot up shooter of the 1990s who you just passed him the ball when he was wide open and he hit, like Steve Kerr, like his coach.
Right.
He takes shots from 30 feet, 27 feet, on the move, step back, 3 pointers, so on and so on and so forth. And what has his singular greatness done? It has made every Tom, Dick, and Harry think that they can shoot jump shots from 27 feet out. So the game of basketball has changed. And this may be a change that's permanent because everybody is looking at Steph and saying, I can do what he does. Now, what ends up happening is that a lot of teams will go, I don't know, 2 for 25 from the 3 point line because they've fallen in love with a particular way of playing the game. And I think, in many respects, the black preacher I'm not saying all are like this, but any of the ones who count King as count themselves as heirs to King's throne, any of the liberation theologists, the social gospel people, any of those people, the Reverend Wrights, the Raphael Warnocks, the Jamal Bryants, the Jesse Jacksons, the Otis Mosses, the William Murphys, all of these guys, the William Barbers, all of these guys have completely, discredited the church because they don't preach the gospel. And their wholesale sort of endorsement of all things leftist, I think has been to the net detriment of the black community. So yeah,
Yeah.
I'm saying I don't know how much of that to lay on King because again, he died at a fairly young age. The same thing with Malcolm X. But if at all you can judge a tree by its fruit, or you can judge a father by his sons, then I think there's something to be said. And I think this goes to your point about the type of kids, so to speak, spiritually, socially, and politically that Dr. King sired.
Respectfully, I don't believe that these individuals, the William Barbers, the Jesse Jacksons, the Al Sharptons, and others, the liberation theologians, as you put it, I don't believe that they are a deviation from MLK, nor do I believe that they hijacked MLK or try to, in a
Mm-hmm.
sense, merely mimic MLK. I think that they are a continuation of MLK, and had MLK not been assassinated, he would have been doing the same things that Jesse Jackson and others were doing. The reason I can say that definitively is because
Mm-hmm.
you see him doing that prior to his having been assassinated, where he was going
Mm-hmm.
into these towns and basically like the whole nonviolent thing is so brilliant. It's just so brilliant because you build these kind of situations in these moments, and you know what's going to happen. You know what's going to ensue. Um, and you do all of this knowing that the threat at the end of all of it is a riot, an all out riot. And
Mm.
you can then use that as political fodder. And, I mean, it just as well as I do, where, Martin Luther King tried to play both sides, where he said, rioting is a language of the
The
unheard.
language you unheard, right,
Yeah.
right, right.
And he's trying to kind of tiptoe it, where like the whole point of nonviolence is you get people into the streets, you don't pull permits, um, so that the traffic can be regulated and the noise can be controlled and all the things. You don't pull the permits, you have these unlawful marches. And to the extent that the sheriff's department shows up and tries to remove you, if you aren't being compliant, you're continuing marching, then they have to necessarily remove you by force. And of course, we kind of
Mm-hmm.
tempered down over time the kind of force that we use to disperse crowds. But, looking into it myself, you saw predominantly white labor unions doing the same kinds of things in terms of the marches that Martin Luther King was doing. These, again,
Mm-hmm.
were predominantly white, and they use what? Dogs and hoses to remove and disperse these crowds. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and not only that, but a lot of these individuals who were a part of the marches weren't themselves Southerners. These were freedom riders and others who were coming down from the North and,
Right.
um, being agitative. And so it wasn't, look, here's how blacks in the South are being treated every day. We must stop this. It was all theatrics. Not all of it was theatrics, but a great deal of it was. And when you look at what Jesse Jackson was doing in the 90s, where they were going to these predominantly white corporations that were situated in predominantly white
Mm-hmm.
areas, and they
Mm-hmm.
were saying that they were discriminating because they don't have enough black employees. Again, these same kind of shakedown tactics that MLK was doing, so too was Jesse doing in the 90s. And so I don't know that MLK would have would have been displeased with what his proverbial sons were doing, because he was doing the same exact things. And not only that, philosophically, ideologically, he aligned with where these people are. And for that reason, I don't know, I think we have enough evidence to say definitively where MLK would have landed. But, I want to kind of get off of that, unless you have something else to say to it.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
with regard to this
Mhm.
debate versus um, this debate of desegregation versus forced integration, do you think that we
Mhm.
ever had a lively, sound, substantive debate on those two positions in this country
It's a
from
good
where you're
question,
standing?
but I do want to address the point that you made, right? And this
Mm-hmm.
is here's my sort of overarching response. It's that, you know, we may think that based on a person's trajectory, we have a sense of where they would land. And oftentimes that's the best that you can do. But I often remind myself, like Eldridge Cleaver, who I think started off as the Minister of Information for the Black Panther Party, when he died in 1998, he was a conservative Republican who was a part of the Church of Latter Day Saints, right? So it's not to say that a person can't change their perspective um, over time, because many do. Thomas Sowell is famous for saying that he used to be a Marxist, and then one summer working at the Department of Labor, sort of did what classes with um, Friedman could not do, which is to make him drop his Marxist leanings. Well, Justice Thomas said, you know, that he I don't know if he was officially part of the Black Panthers, but he certainly was sympathetic to their ideology. So,
Yeah, that's true.
and then the other thing I'm just, and this is sort of a cultural thing, and not to be, take it with a grain of salt, but the show the Boondocks, which probably could not be made nowadays, when they had the MLK episode, and the Dr. King, right, was resurrected from the dead.
Yeah,
Um, he was very critical of things that he saw in the black community,
yeah, but this was a
right?
cartoon.
True, but what I'm saying is it's a cartoon, and they could have written his character in any number of different ways. They could have made him, a permed out Al Sharpton clone, but they didn't.
Yeah, that's
They
true.
made him right. The say that to, it's hard to say where a person would end up, particularly when you're talking about someone who's assassinated in his late 30s. I want to say 39, where he would have ended up at 60 years old, because people do mature. Oftentimes, they become more conservative with age. Um, they would get to see how their ideas ended up being uh, used, and what the results were. Like I'm reminded, like Derek Bell, the father of critical race theory, after a certain point came out and said, you know, maybe Brown versus Board of Ed and integration wasn't the best thing for the black community. Um, so I don't. And then this is the last part I'll say about this, and then I'll go to your question in terms of segregation, desegregation, integration. I find it hard to believe that Dr. King, fighting, whether this was in his heart of hearts or this was just political strategy, um, for the Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, Civil Rights Act, thought to himself, and one day the guys that come after me, they are going to make sure that pregnant men have access to reproductive health care. I find that very, very hard to believe. Now, maybe gay rights stuff, given that Bayard Rustin was one of his closest advisors, maybe. But even that, at that time, would have been something along the lines of, you know, gay men mimicking the sort of bourgeoisie, suburban values, being able to get a job at NBC and buy a house with their partner, roommate, that type of thing, and pass on property. That I highly doubt, even in Bayard Rustin's wildest dreams, that he was thinking, look, you know, the first black president is going to be in office when gay marriage is made legal in the United States, And soon after that is going to come transgenderism and a drag queen in every school. I find that hard to believe. And that's what the guys today are pushing. So what I'm saying is I want to hold them responsible for their own beliefs, for their worldview, for their positions, and to the extent that they are trading on, I don't want to say trading on King's legacy, because I get the point you're making. I think what they're doing is extending King's legacy by saying, this is the new civil rights battle of the day. This is the NAACP, for instance. Trans issues, all things LGBT, all things pride. These are the new civil rights issues of the day. Um, uh, Transgender individuals, gays and lesbians, are the new oppressed group in America. And we, as the NAACP, are going to do what we've always done, which is stand up for the marginalized and oppressed. And we're going to continue that rich legacy, so on and so on and so forth. I think that's more what it is. And is that a continuation of what Dr. King started? Sure, I think it's fair to put some of that there. But these people are also embracing things that no one could have envisioned in the 1960s. So I think it's fair to hold them to
Well,
account
it's a logical
for their
conclusion.
own positions.
Yeah, it's a logical conclusion, not conclusion, but the logical continuation because nothing's really concluded. Um, but this kind of fluidity with which this ilk operates is never ending. I mean, Bayard Rustin was, as you know, was Martin Luther King's mentor, and
Mm-hmm.
he said in the '80s that gays are the new niggers,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, we always have to move in such a way that we're putting at the center the most vulnerable group at a given time. And it just so happens that the powers that be in the space and time that we're sharing right now has
Mm-hmm.
deemed LGBT trans people as the new oppressed group. And so
Right.
when you look at, for example, Jesus, in the Bible, we see him going off and praying, we see him healing, we see him doing all these things. And what is he saying? I don't do anything unless my Father tells me to do it. We see
Mm-hmm.
Martin Luther King doing the same thing under the behest of Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin organized the March on Washington. He wrote a lot of Martin Luther King speeches. He was the proverbial godhead, if you will, when it comes to
Mm.
the way in which Martin Luther King moved. And so if you have Bayard Rustin, who lived longer than Martin Luther King, he died in his old age, saying that we must always put at the center of the group or of our movement the most vulnerable group, and it just so happens that gays are at the center right now, then it would, suffice it to say, or stand to reason that Martin Luther King would have followed suit. But I do want to get off of this, and
Okay.
I do want to revisit this conversation because I want to honor your time, and
Mm-hmm.
um, and I like that you are giving me a lot to think about, and you're giving me some degree of pushback because I think this is healthy and this is much needed.
Yeah, for sure.
Uh, um, uh, what I like about your piece is how you select Jesse Jackson and Louis Farrakhan as a kind of means of understanding where these people would be today, where Malcolm X and Martin Luther King would be today, simply because they both died fairly young, and
Mm-hmm.
and we just don't have any means of or other means of really understanding where they are. But then,
Yeah.
like later on in the piece, you acknowledged the fact that Farrakhan called Malcolm X a traitor, and
Mm-hmm.
he wasn't particularly um, um, happy with some of the decisions that Malcolm X made in his latter years.
Mm-hmm.
The So when you look at someone like a Farrakhan and the fact that, to your point, he said that Malcolm X was a traitor to a room full of applauding people who clapped
Mm-hmm.
upon hearing that. So would it does that mean that Farrakhan has built his prestige, his notoriety uh, by his own merit and not on the back of Malcolm X in the same way that Jesse Jackson built his on the back of Martin Luther King?
That's a good question. So also in that speech, Farrakhan said, next to Elijah Muhammad, there's nobody who I loved. He's talking about at that time, so it's just 1960s. There's no one that I loved more than Malcolm X, right? So it seems that he had some affection for Malcolm X, but I think, you know, my sense is that whatever affection Farrakhan had for Malcolm X was dwarfed by his devotion to Elijah Muhammad at that time, and you know the founder of the Nation of Islam. I think it's Wallace D. Muhammad. I think that's who. Oh,
Can you hear me?
can you hear me?
Yeah.
I can hear
Can you
you.
hear me? Okay. Yeah, somebody said
Yeah,
that
I
my
can
mic
hear
was
you. I
low,
can
so I
hear you.
just okay.
Yeah. So I mean, and Farrakhan said, this is the man that I love in terms of Elijah Muhammad, and this is my spiritual father, and I'm sure he attributes some type of um, I don't want to say he deifies Elijah Muhammad, but he's like, look, this is God's man, appointed man walking on the earth. And as much as I love my brother Malcolm X, to the extent that he was out trying to destroy our father, and doing so by going to the white press and bad mouthing him about something that he, Elijah Muhammad, had every right to do, which was have more than one wife and have children, sexual relations with more than one wife. I think that's why you know, Farrakhan sort of took that position. That being said, um, even if Farrakhan didn't sort of build on Malcolm X per se, I think he built on the foundation. And I say this as someone who was outside of the Nation of Islam, and obviously much. As I'm not old enough to have been around in the 1960s, but this is just how I sort of see it playing out culturally. I think he built on the nation's sort of cultural reputation, for lack of a better term, that for many people starts with Elijah Muhammad and is elevated by Malcolm X.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that, if I had to characterize, the difference between King and X, I'd say that, Dr. King is like, for the black community, like our head, right? The strategic visionary, so on and so on and so forth. And Malcolm X is like our heart, so to speak, right? That fire, that passion, that is like, look, that nonviolent stuff may sound good to some people, but if you come and try to attack me and what I love and try to destroy my family, and this is whether it's to the white Klansmen or the Nation of Islam, then I'm going to be at my window with my rifle, willing to
Right.
defend myself. So I think, that's sort of the juxtaposition between the two. And I think Farrakhan carried that forward and obviously has lived to 90, so he just has a much longer legacy to speak of. Um, and then to be fair, over time he came to, and I think in a interview with 60 Minutes, he was speaking with one of Malcolm X's daughters, and I want to say he apologized for the role he played in creating an environment that was hostile to her father at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So I do not ever see Louis Farrakhan making those statements that he did. I want to assume that was Savior's Day. I want to say it was like 1993. I could not see him going on the Breakfast Club and calling Malcolm X a traitor and saying
Right.
that Malcolm X got exactly what he deserved. I do not see that happening under any circumstance.
Right.
Because if that ever went public and got out and moved from the obscure back channels of YouTube to the front pages where everybody on Black Twitter can comment on it, I think he would take a tremendous hit to his reputation if he did that.
I agree.
Um, So yes, I mean, Farrakhan's a complicated figure. I think a lot of people outside the black community don't understand why so many black people are drawn to him. I think part of it certainly is his willingness to speak about, racism. Um, but I think more than anything, it's the sense that he does call, black folk to do something. And this is
Mm-hmm.
the same thing I said about Malcolm X, right?
Yep.
He if he encountered George Floyd, he would have told him to clean up his act, get off the drugs,
Yeah, you said that in an
you
article.
know, get, yeah, get a job, so on and so on
Mm-hmm.
and so forth. Where certainly Dr. King's disciples, all of their moral appeals are directed towards white people,
Mm-hmm.
whether in Hollywood and corporations and government. So and as I said, I've lived on the East Coast my entire life, and the number of people, and I worked in government, local government in D.C. for almost prior to coming to the Heritage Foundation for almost 15 years, and you frequently hear people say something similar about the Nation of Islam, like this neighborhood was drug infested, had a lot of crime, and so on and so forth, and then the nation came in and they helped clean it all up. So
Mm-hmm.
these are men, regardless of their theological beliefs, which I think are just wacky, is to say the
Right.
least. Um, they carry themselves with a sense of moral uprightness
Mm-hmm.
that, in many respects, is missing from a significant portion of the black preachers. And not to get personal, but I've said this before, so I'll say it here. Somebody like Jamal Bryant, who's now the pastor at Eddie Long's old church,
And over in
New
Atlanta.
Birth Missionary,
Yeah, New Birth. Mm-hmm.
New Birth in Atlanta. I would not let Jamal Bryant be within 100 feet of any woman in my family who's under the age of 100,
Mm-hmm.
um, because just his track record is not one that speaks to a man who can control himself in that
Mm-hmm.
in that way.
Right.
Whereas I've never heard anyone accuse Malcolm X, Louis Farrakhan, or any of the other, some of their most bombastic, uh, racist, anti-Semitic leaders. One thing I've never heard them accused of is infidelity or inappropriate relationships with young women or
The minor.
men or whoever. Um, so in that respect, that personal morality, that element of personal morality is there in ways that oftentimes is lacking within among some of the black preachers. So, you know, I think a lot of times people they respect that about Farrakhan, and that's why he occupies a seat of honor at Aretha Franklin's funeral, or more locally for me, at Mayor Marion Barry's funeral in Washington D.C. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Most of the people there were like center left Democrats, but they respect him, and they certainly would try to distance themselves from his views. But they'll say, at least he fights for us, and I think there's something to be said for that. I will say this: with him turning 90 and Jesse Jackson in declining health, that era of the civil rights movement is done. It's over with. Um, the guys who lived through the 1960s and saw sort of that long social and political arc, they are moving into their next phase of their lives, right? They're on their back nine, so to speak. And I think what we've seen rise in place of that should be even more concerning because for all of King's foibles, personal, political, and theological, at least he would say publicly then that his push to change the laws of our land is rooted in the notion that there is a God and that he cares equally about the white people he creates and the black people he creates. And when you have groups like Black Lives Matter that rise up, who are openly Marxist, who are openly against the nuclear family, who are openly um, pro-trans, pro-feminist, so on and so on and so forth, and have no use for the black church. Um, I think what you have is a completely different animal at play. And I would liken
Mm.
it to this, and then I'll, interested to hear your thoughts. Um, People will often say that prostitution is the world's oldest occupation. Okay, assuming that it is. There's a difference between living in a cultural context in which men and women meet in back alleys or in dark parks or in cars under a underpass to engage in sexual commerce. And there's a difference between that and living in a cultural context in which people engage in that behavior openly in the middle of the town square, on TV during daytime hours, in front of schools, and where that type of activity is recorded and put up on billboards all across the city, right? So yes, people may have ideas and views and values and beliefs that we find distasteful, repugnant, immoral. But when those things go from sort of the private sphere in the back of their mind, um, to the main stage, to the heart and soul of our public culture, now you're in a completely different situation. And I think that's how I would liken the difference between, a Dr. King, for all of his sort of complicated views, and a BLM who are openly saying, you know, the nuclear family should be dismantled, um, and everything else that comes with that.
Yeah. Thank you. Um, no guns, no bullets, just heart for the super chat. They said, finally able to tune in to tonight's live show. Keep up the good work, Chad and crew, Keisha, Chuck, Blanche, and tonight, Delano. So thank you for that super chat. Really appreciate it. Um, yeah, I think you make a very compelling case, Delano. And hold on, let me add myself back to the screen.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure what was going on with my mic. For some reason, like, cause I have your article up, but for some reason, every time I look down at my iPad, it's gone and some ad is up. So I'm wondering what's going on with that. I
Mm-hmm.
think my iPad might be a little buggy, but
I
I
got
love
you.
the way that you ended the article, which I'll get to in a moment. But yeah, as far as you know, like, because you just made the comparison between Martin Luther King and the Black Lives Matter movement today, and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I feel like with Martin Luther King, um, being kind of at his peak in the mid to late 1960s. Well, actually, by the time the late 60s rolled around, his popularity was beginning to wane. Um, but in the early to mid 60s, where he was the most popular, um,
Mm-hmm.
at that time, it would have been counterproductive for him to be open about his Marxist ideas. I mean, when you look at people like James Cone, uh, Clarence B. Jones, and others who now are saying that, well, not so much uh, James Cone because he expired 2 or 3 years ago, but he
Mm-hmm.
went on Democracy Now, and he was on there with Taylor. I forget his last name, but even they were saying that Martin Luther King had Marxist views. His closest friends and comrades knew it, but he would never dare say it in public for fear that he might be labeled a
Mm-hmm.
communist. Of course, in the 1960s, you're still close to what historians now call McCarthyism, or red
Mm-hmm.
baiting or red scaring, and so the general sentiment amongst the American people was that of being anti-communist. And
Mm-hmm.
if they if they listened, if the American people listened to information that the Birch Society was putting out at the time, the John Birch Society, information that people like um, Julia Brown and Manning Johnson and others were putting out in terms of trying to warn people against the communist elements of the civil rights movement, had these
Mm-hmm.
people been listened to over the mainstream media, which was doing its darndest to popularize Martin Luther King, then perhaps he would not be in our textbooks and all these things today. But the fact is, the media won out. Martin Luther King is, we celebrate him every January, and he's taught
Mm-hmm.
in our textbooks, such and so forth. But the fact that the three lesbians, what are their names? I wouldn't have said lesbians if I knew their names off the top of my head. Patrice Cullors,
Patrice Cullors,
Alicia
Alicia
Garza,
Garza, and
and
Opal Tometi.
yeah, Opal Tometi. So the fact
Mm-hmm.
that they are just kind of out and proud with their Marxism is a
Mm-hmm.
testament to the kind of gradual, I would say, erosion of our ideals and principles here in the United States. It's this kind of I don't know. I do believe that people like the leaders of Black Lives Matter owe a lot to the civil rights movement, and people like Martin Luther King to the fact that they do get to now say that, openly, yeah, we're communists, we're Marxists, you know what I mean? Because we are now in a time where through our institutions, this kind of Howard Zinn-esque thing
Mm-hmm.
has happened where it's now vogue or in vogue to be critical and, in a sense, hateful of Western society and of America in particular
Mm-hmm.
than it was in the 1960s when Martin Luther King was being popularized. And so it's for that reason that, you have the Democratic Socialists of America and others who are putting out material and propaganda to, in a sense, galvanize the youth to be a part of their cause. What's his name? Cornel West, who is now teaching at uh, Union Theological Seminary, says that Martin Luther King was a democratic socialist. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, these scholars, these intellectuals will try to say, well, there's a difference between democratic socialism and socialism, or democratic socialism and
Right, right, right.
Marxism, or democratic socialism and communism. But as Stalin said, socialism is basically the road to communism, as we all well know.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, but I'm trying to pull up the last two paragraphs of your article, because I did want to read it on uh,
So
read it on the
can I
slide.
respond while you're doing that? Can I respond to you real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, I actually think comparing BLM with Dr. King actually highlights some of the ways in which today's fight is much different than yesterday's fight. Couple of reasons. One is that I think American culture is like we're not in a Red Scare moment in the way we were in the 1960s, right? Bernie Sanders, if not for probably some interference in his political party, very well could have been a nominee in 2016. Um, and he's not someone who is feared or loathed by the political right. In fact, he's a person who's probably respected more than someone like Hillary Clinton, because at least they'll say, look, he's a socialist. Now, he's a socialist who owns multiple properties in Vermont, but he's a socialist
Right.
nonetheless.
Yeah.
But, we may disagree with him on economic policy, but we get and we understand why young people, particularly, are open to arguments about more social spending on American citizens, strengthening unions and Social Security and Medicare and all those other programs, and less spending on foreign wars, right?
Mm-hmm.
We get why that message is attractive to people, and in some respects, there may be some conservatives who say, you know what, I'm somewhat open to some of these arguments. So the first thing is that I don't think that Marxism in its sort of original economic form is as scary to some people, or socialism is as scary to some people as it was 60 years ago.
I would agree with that.
But the BLM piece is this: we our sort of cultural landscape has changed so much in the last 60 years that avowed Marxists have actually found a market that they have exploited in our capitalist system to make themselves rich. So they claim to be Marxists, they claim to be against capitalism, but first Trayvon Martin dies, Michael Brown, they sort of use it to get BLM off the ground. But once George Floyd, dies on that street in Minneapolis, these ladies who would have crossed the street if George Floyd was approaching them walking down the street while he was alive, and certainly would have no interest in him as a husband or a father of their children, used his dead body on that street to fuel their activism in a way that was so successful that they were able to acquire multiple properties across the country in neighborhoods so white that they make Sweden look like South Africa, right? So what they did is these women are capitalists. It's just that the market that they're looking to exploit is the market of the sort of Marxist sympathizers. So Patrisse Cullors got an offer from Time. I think it was Time Warner to produce content. I think I read it that actually has been rescinded now. Alicia Garza got a book deal. They raked in, I think, over 90 million or some ungodly number in donations. They went and bought a house out in, again, a neighborhood in California that was like 98% white. They were shown clinking their wine glasses and probably eating veal and duck while celebrating sort of the anniversary of George Floyd's death. So we're in a country and at a moment in time, and I actually think that this is a sign of progress, where our elites neither understand Marxism or King's version of, for lack of a better term, anti-racism. Because rich black folk get on TV, I'm thinking like rich black athletes, pundits, politicians, professors, and say that poor white people are privileged, but multimillionaire athletes and even billionaire media moguls like Oprah Winfrey are oppressed.
Yeah.
So that completely shatters that sort of relationship between, bourgeoisie and proletariat. Because again, the rich people are now telling the poor people that you guys have your foot on our neck. And it shatters this notion that, we should be judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin. So we get both King and Marx wrong in this country. And I think that's actually a sign of how far we've progressed in the last 60 years, that a country that used to and you made this point, I mean, for decades, anything that even had a whiff of communism was treated as public enemy number one. And we've gone from that to a nation in which open and avowed Marxists can have their logo emblazoned on basketball courts, football fields. Their talking points accepted by white evangelical Christian churches and conservatives in the Senate right? This is completely topsy turvy world. So I don't know that the lines can be drawn sort of straight from the 1960s to where we are now, because there's just so many different political and cultural dynamics at play. But as I said, a country that feared and hated all things communist, that now embraces three anti-family, anti-God, anti quote unquote anti-capitalist Marxist lesbians, um, shows that uh, the fight that we were fighting 60 years ago is no longer the fight that we have to fight right now.
Yeah. Yeah, those are good points. Uh, I mean, I would slightly differ and say that I wouldn't say that it's a sign of progress as much as it is a sign of us letting our guard down. Because the thing is, Marx is
Okay.
very clear in his manifesto when he said, "Workers of the world unite." He said, "Let
Mm-hmm.
the ruling class tremble at the rise of a proletariat," and this is very threatening, very hostile
Mm-hmm.
language. He was a nihilist. He was an atheist. He
Mm-hmm.
wanted to see the world burn. This is who Karl Marx was, and he developed this philosophy along with Engels. This philosophy was taken into the Western civilization via the Ivy League schools. These youngsters who met in cafes and saloons in Greenwich Village, New York, at the turn of the 20th century, came together and talked about their grievances against the system, although they themselves were heirs and heiresses to $1 million um, um, corporations and empires. These people would go on and establish themselves in America's institutions as the movers and shakers. These were influencers to FDR's administration, who would radically shift and change America to the point where we got rid of the Judeo-Christian undergird of our society. And it's been replaced with this kind of secular humanism. And it's that secular
Mm-hmm.
humanism that is corrupting the generations that come after us, because it's having such a heavy influence on the people. People are more influenced by uh, uh, the entertainment industry than they are by the word of God and by traditional culture.
Mm.
And this is a fact. And so it's to that extent that most people don't even know what Marxism is, and they don't know
True.
how Marxism seeks to enslave them. And so it's for that reason that they are attracted to the glitter and glamour of Marxism and aren't hostile to it. Um, don't get me wrong, as an American, as someone who believes in the freedom of the individual to pursue their version of happiness,
Mm-hmm.
someone who doesn't believe in a theocracy, so to speak, nor am I some kind of nationalist, so to speak. Um, um, I do believe in the autonomy of the states and of the municipalities and of the family on down to the individual. Like, this is what I believe. I believe in the truity of the constitutional republic.
Mm-hmm.
However, if a philosophy or an ideology is being preached that seeks to undermine and to deconstruct that worldview or that country, then I think we should be particularly hostile to that philosophy, more so than to a philosophy that seeks to merely ring in or usher in some kind of more egalitarian system, so to speak. And so the difference
Mm.
between someone who merely wants egalitarianism, or for the truity or the edicts of the Constitution to be made manifest for all people,
Mm-hmm.
namely that states and local governments and the federal government aren't infringing upon your right as a free and American or free American system or citizen with dignity, with autonomy,
Mm-hmm.
with freedom, such and so forth. You're not infringing upon my rights. Of course, this gets into the question of, do we know how to be free as a people? That's a different debate entirely.
Mm-hmm.
I would
Yeah, yeah,
say
yeah, yeah.
probably not, but
I'd
does that
agree with
mean we
that.
need Marxism? No, we don't. But again, Delano, I really enjoyed having you, and I really hope you will come back, because I think this conversation needs to be
Sure.
continued. I did want to read the last two paragraphs from your
Okay.
article, which I thought were phenomenal. He said, quote, both Martin and Malcolm knew that survival in this country requires political capital that comes from organizing and voting, economic capital, or I'm sorry, that comes from organizing and voting, economic capital. Economic capital. I was public school educated, so you have to forgive me. Economic capital that comes from industriousness. Did I say that right? Industriousness,
Mm-hmm.
entrepreneurship, and ownership, and social capital that comes from strong families and communities. So the more important question is this: where should blacks put their emphasis today in order to secure a brighter future for our progeny 6 decades from now? That one is much easier to answer. It's a lot more important to secure, and this is my favorite sentence. It's a lot more important to secure your own house than it is to decide the next occupant of the White House. Tell me why you landed your plane there.
Yeah, I mean, the question I was asking was sort of a retrospective question, right? Whose philosophy has done more good for the black community over the last 60 plus years? And one of the things that I'll say, Chad, is this. I'm a big fan of history. I won't call myself a student of history per se, because I think a student would have to study a lot more than I do. But I respect it. I respect my family's history. I respect national history, world history, biblical history. But I think, particularly within the black community, we spend an inordinate amount of time looking in the rearview mirror. And I think that any culture, country, civilization, or community that spends more time trying to dissect the society that their ancestors inhabited rather than trying to understand the society that their descendants will inherit is a society that is headed for some serious trouble. So while the question of, who was better for black folk back then, King or Dr. Malcolm X, is, a nice thing to debate, I'm much more interested in what type of worldview is going to get us where we want to be in the next 60 years. And what can we do today to ensure that the world that we pass on to our children, we're both fathers, right? That we pass on a world that our kids and grandkids and great grandkids can thrive and flourish in. So that's why I wanted to talk about the types of things that I think help with that. And these are timeless values. These are biblical values. And these are values that black leaders of times past understood. Like, as they talked about industriousness and thrift, and temperance and self-control, and all of these different virtues, honor and dignity, self-respect. And I think that those are the things that you need to create a public culture. Um, so the notion that the black community is going to be saved through political representation, political power, is to me probably one of, if not the single most damaging sort of idea that's been circulated in pop culture over the last, I don't know, 3 to 6 decades. We have more elected officials than we've ever have had, and in many cities things look a lot worse, certainly than in my lifetime. So the notion that electing, at one point CNN wrote an article and said all four of the mayors of America's largest cities, four largest cities, are black.
Hmm.
So they were talking about New York and Eric Adams, L.A. with Karen Bass, I think right after she was elected, Chicago with Lori Lightfoot, and then Houston with is it Sylvester Turner?
Yeah, that's it.
Um,
Well, Sylvester Turner New Orleans?
No, I think
No, I think
it's
you're right. That
yeah,
was
yeah,
Houston. That was
yeah.
Houston.
Sylvester Turner. So I'm like, okay, that's nice. It's nice for all their families. Nice, sweet income, pension, healthcare, 24-hour security. But what does that have to do with the average person living, on the south side of Chicago or East Flatbush in Brooklyn, New York? So yeah, so I think we need to get back, and this is an American thing, but particularly within the context of the Black community, um, to building up sort of our cultural capital, building strong families, strong communities. At the center of that, in my opinion, has to be a strong sense of religious faith or moral conviction. And then from there, we can build. You can build on that solid foundation. You can build enterprise. You can be an entrepreneur. You can be a tradesman. You can be an intellectual. You can, play the options during the day and go to work and do, all sorts of other things. But without that solid foundation of family, community, and church, no amount of government intervention is going to make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
None. Because all you're doing is trying to, um, you know, pour into a weak and unsteady foundation. So ultimately, I've said it. I think I've said it in other places. Also, I'll say it here. If we don't get our family situation right, there will be no black community in 30 years. There will be neighborhoods with black people in them. But one of the things that distinguishes a community from just a random assortment of people is that communities have standards, right? Communities have values. Communities have cultures. Um, and if we're in a situation, let's say in 30 years, where 90% of black children are born to unwed parents, a significant number of black folk are going to be wards of the state.
Right.
Um, and local, state, local, and the federal government will be functioning as the de facto father and husband of millions of households. And you're not building a community on that. And all the talk about wealth inequality and all sorts of stuff is useless. What are you even talking about, right? Uncle Sam, if Uncle Sam's your dad, he'll give you just enough for you to survive.
Right.
So I think it was important to sort of end there, which is to say, yes, this question may be important as an intellectual exercise, and to learn some things as we move forward in the future. But ultimately, as it relates to our future as a collective of people, right? Again, coming from different places, different backgrounds, but some shared sense of history and common destiny. Um, the most important thing is what's going on in our respective houses, not you know the House of Representatives and the White House. So
I agree. 100%. Thank you, Ira Singleton, for the super chat. They said, great conversation. Thanks for the information and knowledge. So I appreciate that. Delano, thank you so much for coming on. You could have been
sure,
anywhere else in
my
the world,
pleasure,
but
man.
you chose to come on with me. So I appreciate that. And hopefully
For
we
sure.
can continue on this conversation. I look forward to more of your articles. Again, very prolific writer, very knowledgeable. Causes me to think. I like that kind of intellectual stimulation. But you write in a very palatable and approachable way. That's not that doesn't fly over people's heads. So you have a gift, and I really appreciate you sharing that with the world. So
I appreciate that, man. That means a lot coming from you. So
yeah,
yeah, thank you for that. And I try to pattern that after Justice Thomas. He talks about how he writes opinions and trying to write them in such a way that you know the everyman can get them. So try to strike a balance. I
hmm
got a few 10-cent words, and I want to sprinkle them in there every once in a while. But to me, the mark of true intellect is to take $100 $100 idea and boil it down into 5-cent language
Hmm.
But too often, what intellectuals do is take a 5 cent concept and wrap it in fake $100 bills. So
Yeah.
I try to avoid that whenever possible. So yeah,
Right.
I'm just trying to grow where I'm planted, right? And
Mm.
work whatever few things. I realized at a certain age I wasn't going to grow any taller, so NBA was out. A lot of other professions were out. I don't have any artistic skills or anything like that, but God has given me a way with words and the ability to think about things, complex subjects, in a fairly straightforward and analytical way. So I just try to use the one thing that I know how to do, and to the extent that that edifies or informs other people, I'm thankful for that, and I give God honor and glory for that. So thank you. Those are kind words from you, and I appreciate your work and look forward to Uncle Tom's 3, 4, and 5, and we'll continue to be a
Yeah.
fan and supporter of yours as well.
3 will be the finale. So, but yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I'm done with dealing with black stuff. So, well,
I
cool.
feel you. I feel you.
I'll. I know it's late. Get some rest. I'm gonna text you
Mhm.
later. For
Okay.
those of you in the audience, I'm gonna play for you in closing a video. It's not a very long video. It's a couple seconds long from whenever I went to visit Dr. J.H. Jackson's church after doing my research for Uncle Tom Part 2. So, without further ado, enjoy, and I'll see you guys next time. God bless.
Cool. All right.
And here you go. Now, give me. Yeah, there you go.
Did you grow up in this church?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
So you actually got to hear J.H. Jackson preach?
Yes, I did. Yeah, in fact, I've been here through 3 pastors: Reverend J.H. Jackson, Reverend Michael Noble, and our current pastor, Reverend John Smith. Have you looked at any of our stuff on the website?
No, I haven't.
Olivet Baptist Church Chicago .org.
Okay. Yeah, I'll look into that. What did you make of Dr. J.H. Jackson's preaching generally?
Okay, great orator. One of the strange things, though, is that he wrote a few books. You could find some books. I don't think we've got any here, but
Okay.
he is published. But as far as recordings of his sermons, I don't think there are any.
I found 2, and that's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I've heard. I don't know if I've heard any more than that.
Mhm.
Heard of any more than 2. So.
What's interesting to me is he was the most popular black pastor in America whenever he was alive. And he was a president of the National Baptist Convention.
Yeah.
However, a lot of people today
pastor had been president of the National Baptist Convention too. L.K. Williams.
Right. But what's interesting is, like, as popular as he was, and as world traveled as he was, and as well read as he was, today not many people know about him.
Right. Well, and that's societal change.
Mm-hmm.
I think when the civil rights movement got more aggressive in its activities and the way it was doing things, things shifted, and it kind of shifted away from him. Although he was an advocate of civil rights and black empowerment.
Right.
But I think his desired tools might have been different from, let's say, Dr. King, that's
Right.
CLC and all of them.
Well, from what I read, and I'll let you go, but from what I read, as far as what he's written, he reminds me a lot of Booker T. Washington and what Booker T. Washington pushed for.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that's a good way of saying it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things like that. I think
Right.
That's a good way of saying it.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I appreciate your time.
All right.
And I'll definitely give this man a call. And,
All right, yeah.
And I hope you don't mind me taking pictures outside. But,
Go ahead.
All right,
Go
thank you so much.
All right, take good care.
Yes, sir.
Tell Gene King gave that to me. Told
Okay.
And tell Arnold that I told you to give him a call.
All right, appreciate it.
Thank you.